The cruelest lies are the ones that come true in someone else's arms. The first thing Ethan Cole heard that night wasn't the soft violin drifting through the private dining room or the muted clink of silver against china. It was a little boy's voice, bright and effortless, slicing straight through 6 years of silence. "Dad, can I have another piece of cake?" Time stopped at the far end of the long walnut table. Ethan's hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass as his eyes snapped toward the child seated between Nia Brooks and the man beside her. The room was bathed in amber candlelight, all gold reflections and polished crystal, the kind of charity dinner built for appearances and headlines. Yet in that single breath, the skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the investors laughing 2 tables over, the city lights of Chicago shimmering beneath the winter sky, none of it existed anymore. Only the boy. Only those eyes. Gray-blue. His eyes. Micah Hayes looked no older than 6, dressed in a tiny navy blazer that mirrored Daniel's, his curls neat, his smile easy, his whole body turned toward the man Ethan had never met until tonight. Daniel Hayes leaned down with the relaxed warmth of someone used to being needed. "Only if you finish your vegetables first, buddy." Micah groaned dramatically, then laughed, and the sound hit Ethan harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Across from them, Nia sat poised in a deep emerald dress, the candlelight catching against her dark skin like bronze polished by fire. She didn't rush to explain. She didn't flinch beneath the weight of Ethan's stare. Instead, she lifted her glass with calm fingers and took a slow sip, as if she had already lived this moment 1,000 times in her mind and knew exactly how it would land. 6 years earlier, in a Manhattan conference room of steel and glass, Ethan had watched her sign divorce papers with hands steadier than his own. He could still hear the scrape of his silver pen across the paper, still hear his own cold voice telling her, "No one is ever going to love a woman like you again." At the time, it had felt like control, a final sentence from a man too proud to admit he was terrified of losing someone he never truly understood. Nia hadn't cried. She had only stood, adjusted the sleeve of her coat, and walked away into the December cold without looking back. Now here she was, not broken, not bitter, but radiant, loved, chosen, untouchable. Ethan forced air back into his lungs as Micah reached for Daniel's hand beneath the table with the unconscious trust only children carry. The small fingers wrapped around Daniel's larger ones like they belonged there, like they had belonged there for years. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He searched the boy's face again, the shape of his mouth, the stubborn set of his chin, the way his brows drew together in concentration before he took another bite of green beans. It was like staring into an old childhood photograph buried in one of his mother's albums. His throat tightened. "Nia," he said, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded thinner than he intended. She finally looked at him fully, her gaze steady, unreadable, powerful in its stillness. "Yes, Ethan." The use of his name, without warmth, somehow hurt more than anger ever could. He swallowed once, trying to keep the polished CEO mask fixed over the cracks splitting through his chest. "How old is he?" Her eyes held his for a beat too long. Long enough for Daniel to glance up, sensing the shift in the room, his arm instinctively settling behind Micah's chair. Protective. Present. The kind of movement Ethan had once been too consumed by quarterly reports and acquisitions to understand. Nia set her glass down with deliberate softness. 6, she said. One word. One number. But it detonated through him with the precision of truth finally finding its mark. 6 years. 6 years since the divorce. 6 years since she vanished from his world. 6 years of birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, first days of school, fevers in the middle of the night, Christmas mornings, and father-son moments Ethan had never even known existed. His eyes drifted to Daniel again, to the quiet confidence in the man's posture, the ease in Micah's smile whenever he leaned close. Ethan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He's mine, isn't he?" For the first time that evening, Nia's expression shifted, not into cruelty, but into something far sharper. Truth wrapped in dignity. She glanced at Daniel, then back at Ethan. "Biology?" she said softly. "Yes." Her eyes moved to Micah, who was happily licking frosting from the corner of his fork, oblivious to the storm gathering over the adults at the table. Then Nia delivered the line that made Ethan feel the full weight of everything he had lost. But father. Her gaze rested on Daniel's hand over Micah's shoulder. That title was earned. And just as Ethan's world began to tilt beneath the elegance of the dinner room, a waiter stepped forward and whispered that the gala host wanted all families to gather for the father's legacy photo in the ballroom next door. The ballroom doors opened in a wash of golden light and low conversation, the kind of polished elegance that only old money and careful philanthropy could create. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm reflections across black tuxedos, silk gowns, and champagne flutes as families drifted toward the stage for the father's legacy photo, the gala's signature closing moment. Ethan stepped into the room on legs that no longer felt entirely steady, every instinct in him sharpened by the sight ahead. Micah had already slipped his small hand into Daniel's, his little dress, shoes tapping softly over the marble as he walked with the easy trust of a child who had never needed to question where he belonged. Nia moved beside them in calm silence, one hand resting lightly at the small of Micah's back, guiding him through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built peace from what someone else once called ruin. Ethan followed several paces behind, close enough to see every detail that made the truth impossible to outrun. The boy's laugh, the familiar tilt of his chin, the way he glanced up at Daniel before every step, as if checking that the man he called father would always still be there. The photographer near the stage lifted his camera and called out with practiced cheer, "All fathers and children front and center, please. Moms, spouses, and family right behind." The words landed in Ethan's chest like a verdict. Daniel crouched slightly, straightening Micah's tiny blazer with a smile that was warm, patient, and deeply lived in. "Ready, champ?" he asked. Micah nodded eagerly. "Can I stand next to you, Dad?" The question was innocent, almost casual, but Ethan felt it crack through the carefully built walls around his composure. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Always." The single word carried years inside it. Years Ethan had never seen. Nia stepped just behind them as the host directed families into rows beneath the gala banner. Ethan remained at the edge of the ballroom, frozen among strangers, investors, and socialites who had no idea they were witnessing the collapse of a story he had spent 6 years believing was finished. His mind dragged him backward to the day Nia walked out of his Manhattan office tower with divorce papers in one hand and her pride in the other. He remembered thinking she would eventually come back, that the city would wear her down, that loneliness would prove him right. Instead, she had done the one thing his ego never allowed him to imagine. She had built a life where his absence no longer mattered. The flash from the photographer's camera pulled him back. Micah leaned naturally against Daniel's side, as if every family portrait the boy had ever known had been framed exactly this way. Daniel's hand rested protectively on his shoulder. Nia stood behind them, glowing with a kind of quiet certainty Ethan had once mistaken for softness. But now he understood it for what it really was. Strength refined by survival. The host laughed lightly as he adjusted the group. "Let us get one with the dads kneeling down beside the kids." Daniel immediately dropped to one knee beside Micah, smiling up at him. The little boy giggled and wrapped an arm around Daniel's neck. "Do not move," the photographer said. Perfect. Ethan could not breathe. The image in front of him was too complete, too lived in, too real. It was not performative affection for a gala camera. It was the kind of bond built in grocery store aisles, on soccer sidelines, in bedtime stories read under soft lamplight, in whispered reassurances after bad dreams. It was fatherhood, in its truest form, not announced by blood, but proven by presence. And then Micah looked out across the crowd and saw Ethan standing there. For one suspended second, the noise of the ballroom softened into a distant hum. The boy's gray-blue eyes met his, curious but untroubled, carrying no recognition beyond polite familiarity. Then Micah turned back toward Daniel and tugged his sleeve. "Dad, after this can we still go get hot chocolate?" Daniel smiled. "With extra marshmallows." Micah beamed. Ethan's throat tightened so sharply it almost hurt. 6 winters. 6 years of hot chocolate after school events, birthday candles, scraped knees kissed better by the wrong man, and yet somehow the right father. He had missed all of it. Not because he had been denied. Because he had made himself the kind of man Nia could not trust with her future. The camera flashed again, capturing the family as if it had always been whole. Nia's eyes lifted from Micah to Ethan, and this time there was no triumph in them, no bitterness, no revenge. Only truth. A calm, devastating truth that did not need to be spoken aloud. He had once promised she would never be loved again. Yet here she stood, wrapped in the kind of love that had rewritten every cruel word he had ever said. As the applause from the ballroom rose around the completed photo, the gala host stepped to the microphone with a smile and announced that the children would now be escorted to the adjoining lounge for dessert and family memory cards, where each child would write the name of the person they considered their greatest father figure. The dessert lounge glowed with the kind of warmth only childhood memories seemed to hold forever. Soft amber sconces lined the paneled walls, and a long table near the fireplace was dressed with miniature cakes, chocolate-dipped strawberries, and silver pitchers of hot cocoa crowned with thick swirls of whipped cream. The children spilled into the room with bright laughter, their polished shoes forgotten against the plush carpet as they gathered around a smaller table where cream-colored cards and gold fountain pens had been neatly arranged. Above the station, a handwritten sign in elegant script read, "Write the name of the person who showed you what fatherhood means." Ethan stopped just outside the doorway, the words striking him with a force far sharper than the ballroom photo had. Through the open archway, he watched Micah climb into a velvet chair, his small legs swinging lightly as he reached for one of the cards. Daniel took the seat beside him without being asked, close enough for their shoulders to touch, while Nia stood nearby with a mug of tea in her hands, her expression calm, unreadable, but somehow softer in the glow of the firelight. The rest of the room faded for Ethan. The gala guests, the distant music, the clink of dessert forks against porcelain all dissolved into the sight of one little boy gripping a gold pen with careful concentration. "Spell it for me," Micah asked, looking up at Daniel with complete trust. Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to 1,000 ordinary moments no one else had seen. "You know how to spell it, buddy. Take your time." Micah bit his lip in thought, tongue peeking at the corner of his mouth as he slowly pressed each letter into the card. Ethan's chest tightened with every stroke of the pen. "D-A-D." The room did not tilt this time. It hollowed. Ethan had built empires out of precision, acquisition, and timing, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the quiet devastation of watching his own son choose another man with such innocent certainty. 6 years collapsed inward. 6 years of believing Nia had simply moved on. 6 years of assuming if there had been anything important, she would have called. Yet standing there now, Ethan could finally see the arrogance hidden inside that assumption. He had been the one who told her she was unlovable. He had been the one who reduced their marriage to efficiency and measurable outcomes. He had been the one who taught her that vulnerability with him came at the price of being diminished. Why would she have trusted him with the most fragile truth of all? Micah lifted the card proudly. "Done." Daniel glanced at it and gave a low, warm laugh. "Perfect." Then the little boy did something Ethan had not expected. He turned in his chair, scanning the doorway until his eyes landed on Ethan. "Mr. Cole." The title cut through him, polite and distant. Ethan forced a smile that felt thinner than paper. "Yeah, buddy." Micah held up the card as if showing off a school project. "Do you think he will like it?" His small hand pointed to Daniel, pure joy bright in his face. Ethan looked at the uneven gold letters. "Dad." The simplicity of it carried every bedtime story, every hand held crossing a street, every Saturday pancake breakfast, every reassuring presence after a nightmare. Things Ethan had once thought too small to matter now towered over him as the architecture of love itself. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I think he is going to love it." Daniel's gaze met Ethan's then, not smug, not territorial, just steady. A man secure in what had been built through years of showing up. It was not triumph in his eyes. It was something almost harder to bear. Compassion. Nia stepped closer then, the faint scent of jasmine and winter air following her. And for the first time since dinner, Ethan found himself alone beside her while the children moved toward the cocoa table. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked quietly. The question carried no accusation now, only the ache of finally understanding what had been lost. Nia's eyes rested on Micah as he laughed over a marshmallow mustache Daniel had jokingly pointed out. "Because the last thing you gave me before I left was certainty," she said softly. Ethan frowned. "What certainty?" She turned to face him fully, her voice calm. dignified, and devastating in its honesty. That love around you was conditional. That value had to be earned through perfection. I was pregnant, terrified, and already carrying the weight of your words. Ethan felt the memory slam into him with merciless clarity. No one is ever going to love a woman like you again. He closed his eyes for a brief second, shame moving through him in slow, undeniable waves. Nia continued, not cruel, only truthful. Daniel never asked me to prove my worth. He never treated Micah like an obligation. He simply stayed. Across the room, Micah laughed again as Daniel lifted him high enough to reach the whipped cream. On the cocoa bar, the boys grinned wide and trusting beneath the soft lounge lights. Ethan watched the ease between them, the kind of love built in moments so small they only reveal their weight years later. Then the gala coordinator stepped into the lounge with a bright smile and announced that the final event of the evening would begin in the memory hall, where each child's card would be read aloud in front of every attending family. The memory hall was quieter than the rest of the gala, almost reverent, as if the room itself understood that some truths arrived dressed as children's handwriting. Velvet curtains framed the small stage, and soft golden spotlights spilled over a polished oak podium where the gala host stood with a crystal bowl full of folded memory cards. Families filled the semicircle of round tables below, candlelight flickering across attentive faces, while a pianist in the corner played something low and gentle that seemed to hold the whole evening in suspension. Ethan took his place near the back, not hidden, but not belonging anywhere closer either. From there, he could see Micah seated between Nia and Daniel in the front row, the boy's legs swinging under his chair, hot cocoa still warming his small hands. He looked happy, safe, entirely unaware that every second of this night was rewriting the emotional geography of Ethan's life. The host smiled warmly into the microphone. Tonight, our children remind us that fatherhood is not about titles. It is about the person who stays, guides, and loves when it matters most. The words moved through the room like a shared breath. Ethan felt each one land with unbearable precision. The bowl shimmered beneath the light as the host reached in and drew the first card. One by one, children's voices and simple truths filled the room. A little girl thanked her grandfather for walking her to school every morning. A teenage boy honored the stepfather who taught him how to drive and never missed a baseball game. The room laughed softly, sighed, applauded. Every story circled the same quiet truth. Love was measured in presence. Then the host lifted a cream-colored card written in uneven gold ink. Ethan knew it. Before the first letter was spoken, something in his chest braced for impact anyway. This one is from Micah Hayes, the host announced with a smile. The room turned toward the front table where Micah sat straighter in his chair, cheeks glowing with pride. Daniel's hand rested lightly at the boy's back, steadying without controlling, the instinctive gesture of someone who had spent years making sure a child always felt supported. The host unfolded the card and began to read. My dad is the best because he always comes when I call. He makes pancakes on Saturdays, helps me with my math homework, and checks under my bed when I have bad dreams. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room, warm and affectionate. Ethan's fingers curled at his sides. Pancakes, homework, bad dreams. The architecture of fatherhood built in moments he had once considered too small to matter. The host continued, voice gentler now. He says being brave does not mean you are not scared. It means you still stay kind. He came to every school play, even the one where I forgot my lines. He told me I was still the best tree in the whole forest. The room broke into laughter again, followed by applause, but Ethan barely heard it. In his mind, he saw Daniel in a folding chair at an elementary school auditorium, smiling at a little boy dressed in green felt, cheering for forgotten lines and tiny courage. A life Ethan had not only missed, but once made impossible for himself to be part of. The host reached the final lines, and the room seemed to soften around the innocence in the words. He is my dad because he never leaves. Love, Micah. Silence followed, not empty but full. The kind of silence created when truth lands exactly where it belongs. Then the applause rose, louder than before, and Micah beamed as Daniel leaned down to kiss the top of his curls. Nia's hand found Micah's shoulder, her smile quiet, proud, and touched with the peace of a woman who had survived enough to recognize real love when it finally stood beside her. Ethan felt something inside him give way. Not dramatic, not public, just a quiet collapse of the story he had once told himself about power, worth, and what truly made someone matter. He had spent years believing success could substitute for presence, that resources could eventually repair absence, that blood alone would one day give him a claim. But a 6-year-old's handwriting had just dismantled every lie wealth had allowed him to protect. The host smiled toward Micah. "Would you like to come up and hand this to your dad yourself?" The little boy nodded eagerly and slid from his chair. Daniel rose with him, but Micah surprised everyone by taking the card in both hands and walking alone toward the stage with careful, determined steps. Ethan watched every footfall as the boy reached the podium, accepted the microphone with both hands, and turned not toward Daniel first, but toward the entire room. His small voice carried with startling clarity. "My dad says family is the people who choose you every day." The room fell into a hush, so complete Ethan could hear the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain at the farthest table. Micah turned then, smiling wide, and walked directly to Daniel, placing the card into his hands before wrapping his arms around the man's neck. The applause that followed felt distant, almost underwater to Ethan. Nia's eyes lifted across the room and met his, not with victory, but with a calm compassion that somehow made the loss even sharper. Ethan swallowed hard as a gala staff member stepped to the microphone and announced the surprise final tribute of the evening. Every father figure named in the cards would now be invited on stage for a live family recognition interview, beginning with Daniel Hayes and the family seated beside him. Daniel Hayes stepped onto the stage with the kind of calm grace that never asked the room for approval because it had never built its worth on applause. Micah's small hand was wrapped tightly around his, and Nia followed just behind them, her emerald gown catching the soft gold light as if the evening itself had chosen to frame her in dignity. The host welcomed them with a smile that was both warm and curious, the kind reserved for families whose quiet love had already moved an entire ballroom. "Daniel," she said into the microphone, "Micah just gave us one of the most heartfelt tributes of the night. Tell us, what does fatherhood mean to you?" Daniel glanced down at Micah first, and Ethan felt the answer before the man ever spoke. It was there in the instinctive softness in his eyes, in the way his thumb brushed across the boy's knuckles, in the ease of years no speech could fake. Daniel lifted the microphone. "Fatherhood means showing up when no one is watching," he said, his voice steady and unhurried. "It is not about being perfect. It is about being present. Pancakes on Saturdays, school pickups in the rain, sitting on the edge of the bed after a nightmare, and staying until the room feels safe again. It is the small things done, so often they become the shape of trust." A hush settled over the room. Ethan stood motionless at the back, every word stripping another layer from the illusion he had lived inside. He had once believed grand gestures could replace ordinary devotion. That one day, if truth ever surfaced, money and regret could somehow bridge the years. But Daniel was describing a life built in moments too small for headlines and too sacred for performance. The host smiled gently. "And what made you decide to become that for him?" Daniel's gaze lifted to Nia then, and something in the tenderness between them made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if everyone had been invited into the truth of what love looks like when it is chosen daily. "I did not decide in one moment," Daniel said softly. "I decided every day. The day I met Micah, he was only a few months old. Nia had just moved to Chicago. She was rebuilding everything from the ground up, and she did not need saving. She needed peace. I remember he would not sleep unless someone hummed to him. So I sat beside his crib one winter night for almost 3 hours humming the same old jazz tune until the snow stopped tapping against the apartment windows." Micah smiled up at him. "You still sing it?" Daniel laughed under his breath. "I do." The room melted into quiet smiles and knowing sighs. Nia's eyes glistened, not with pain, but with the deep emotion of someone hearing her survival honored instead of rewritten. Daniel continued, and Ethan felt the truth of every year he had missed sharpen with unbearable clarity. Then came preschool drop-offs, scraped elbows at the playground, spelling tests, learning how to tie shoes, the first soccer goal, the second grade play where he was the tree everyone is still talking about. The ballroom laughed warmly. Micah grinned, burying his face shyly into Daniel's side. Ethan could almost see the years unfolding in front of him like scenes from a life he had once been invited to share and then lost through his own arrogance. Daniel's voice softened further. At some point, I stopped thinking about biology or labels. He was simply my son in every way that mattered. Not because of blood, because love had already done the work. The applause came slowly this time, less like celebration and more like recognition. Ethan's chest tightened so sharply he had to steady himself against the back of a chair. Across the stage, Nia reached for Daniel's free hand, and in that small gesture Ethan saw the entire architecture of what had been built without him. Trust, consistency, healing, a family forged in ordinary kindness. The host turned to Micah with a bright smile. And what makes him the best dad? Micah took the microphone in both hands, his little voice clear and fearless. Because he always stays. 3 simple words. Yet they moved through Ethan like a final reckoning. Always stays. Not once had Micah said the word love tonight without attaching it to presence. Ethan's mind dragged him back to that Manhattan office, to cold glass walls and colder words, to the moment he had told Nia and no one would ever love her. He understood now that what he had really said was that he did not know how. The host beamed at the family. That may be the most beautiful definition we have heard all evening. Then her smile widened as she glanced toward the back of the room. We actually have one final question tonight, and it is for everyone who believes family can still heal. Is there anyone here who wishes they had shown up sooner? The room shifted with soft murmurs, and before Ethan could stop himself, every eye in the ballroom turned toward the shadowed space where he stood alone. For one suspended moment, the ballroom held its breath. Ethan stood in the shadows near the back wall, the weight of hundreds of eyes settling over him. But for the first time in his life, it did not feel like pressure to perform. It felt like truth asking whether he was finally ready to stop hiding behind polish, status, and carefully measured distance. The host's question still lingered in the warm air. Is there anyone here who wishes they had shown up sooner? Ethan's throat tightened. He looked toward the stage where Micah stood tucked close to Daniel's side, small fingers still wrapped around the edge of his jacket, and Nia beside them, calm as ever, her expression unreadable but no longer guarded in the way it had been years ago. Slowly, almost as if some deeper part of him had already made the choice before his mind caught up, Ethan stepped forward. The soft carpet muted his footsteps, yet each one seemed to echo through his chest. The room parted without anyone saying a word. Investors, philanthropists, families in evening gowns and tuxedos moved just enough to create a path, and Ethan walked it with none of the certainty he once wore like armor. By the time he reached the stage, the golden light had stripped away every illusion of control. He was no longer the billionaire founder people quoted in business magazines. He was simply a man standing in front of the family he had failed to understand. The host offered him the microphone with a kindness that made the moment feel less like judgment and more like invitation. Ethan accepted it, his hand unsteady for the first time anyone in the room had ever seen. He looked at Micah first, because anything else would have been another form of cowardice. The boy's gray-blue eyes stared back with open curiosity, not fear, not anger, only the innocent patience children reserve for adults they believe will eventually tell the truth. Ethan swallowed hard. Yes, he said quietly, his voice rough around the edges. I should have shown up sooner. The words moved through the room like a released breath. No dramatic gasp followed, no scandalized whispers, only the stillness that comes when honesty finally enters a space built on appearances. Ethan turned then, his eyes finding Nia. 6 years collapsed into the distance between them. The Manhattan office. The winter night she walked away. The sentence he had used like a weapon because he was too emotionally stunted to call it fear. His voice softened. I thought love was something people had to earn from me. I thought success, security, and control were enough to build a life. His gaze dropped briefly to Micah before lifting again. I was wrong. Nia said nothing, but there was no cruelty in her silence. Only space. Space for truth to stand on its own feet. Ethan continued, every word feeling less like performance and more like confession. I spent years believing I was waiting for the right moment to make things right. But the truth is, there is no right moment after you choose absence. There is only the life that keeps moving without you. Daniel's hand remained steady at Micah's shoulder, not possessive, not threatened, simply present in the way he had always been. Ethan looked at him next, and for the first time there was no rivalry in the glance, no silent measuring of status or success. Only respect sharpened by painful clarity. "You became the man I should have been," Ethan said. The room felt even quieter. Daniel's expression did not shift into triumph. If anything, it softened. Compassion again. That impossible grace Ethan had not earned, but was being shown anyway. Then Micah tilted his head, his small voice breaking the emotional weight with innocent precision. "Why didn't you come?" The question was so simple it cut deeper than any accusation could have. Ethan knelt instinctively, so they were eye level, the stage lights warming the polished wood beneath him. He chose the truth because anything less would only repeat the harm. "Because I did not know how to love people the way they deserved," he said softly. "I thought being important at work mattered more than being present at home. I did not understand what I was losing until tonight." Micah considered this with the serious thoughtfulness only children can hold. Then he glanced up at Daniel, then back to Ethan. "My dad says people can learn if they really mean it." Ethan felt the words land somewhere deeper than shame. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, threaded through the wreckage of regret. He looked at Daniel, who gave the smallest nod, not permission, not approval, just acknowledgement that growth begins where pride ends. The host dabbed lightly beneath one eye, clearly moved, then stepped closer with a warm smile. "Then perhaps tonight is not about what was lost," she said gently, "but what truth makes possible next." The audience responded with soft applause, not celebratory, but tender, as if they understood they were witnessing the beginning of something too delicate for spectacle. Ethan rose slowly, still looking at Micah, when the little boy surprised everyone by stepping forward and holding out his half-finished mug of cocoa. "Do you want some? It has extra marshmallows." A ripple of warm laughter moved through the room. Ethan smiled through the tightness in his chest and accepted the small offering like it was the first real gift he had ever been given. Before he could answer, the gala coordinator returned to the stage and announced that the final private family suite upstairs had been prepared for the evening's featured family, where one last recorded conversation would be captured for the Foundation's legacy archive, and all four of them were invited. The private family suite on the top floor felt nothing like the grand ballroom below. The noise of applause, crystal, and polished speeches had faded into a distant hush, replaced by the soft hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Chicago stretched beneath them in ribbons of gold and white, winter lights reflecting across the river like broken stars stitched back together. Inside the suite, the mood was quieter, warmer, more honest. A fire glowed low in the marble hearth, and 4 armchairs had been arranged in a loose circle around a small oak table where the Foundation's legacy recorder sat waiting, its single red light blinking with patient steadiness. For the first time all night, there was no audience, no gala host, no strangers watching truth unfold. Only the 4 people whose lives had collided around one little boy's understanding of love. Micah was the first to break the silence. He climbed into the oversized chair between Daniel and Nia, knees tucked under him, still clutching the mug Ethan had handed back after taking only one sip. "Do we just talk?" he asked. The Foundation coordinator at the door smiled softly. "Just talk about family." Then she stepped out, closing the door behind her with a gentle click that somehow made the room feel even more intimate. Ethan remained standing for a beat too long, uncertain in a way that would have been unimaginable to the version of himself who once ran Manhattan boardrooms like chess matches. Then Daniel gestured toward the empty chair across from them. "Sit down, Ethan." There was no edge in his voice, no challenge, only the calm steadiness of a man secure enough in his place that he did not need to defend it. Ethan sat. The firelight softened the sharp lines of everyone's faces, and for a long moment no one spoke. It was Micah, again, who moved the night forward. "Mom," he said, looking up at Nia, "did you know I was going to call Dad the best one tonight?" A faint smile touched Nia's lips. "I had a feeling." Micah grinned proudly, then turned to Ethan with the same open curiosity that had quietly undone him all evening. "Did it make you sad?" The question could have embarrassed a weaker man, but in the hush of the suite it felt like what it truly was. A child asking for emotional honesty. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment to the flames. "Yes," he admitted. "It made me sad because it showed me how much I missed." Micah considered that, his small face serious. Dad says missing things does not mean you cannot still come to the next one. Ethan looked up sharply, the words striking him with the kind of grace he had spent years believing he no longer deserved. Daniel leaned back in his chair, one arm resting lightly along the back behind Micah, his presence still protective without ever becoming possessive. There are always next moments, Daniel said quietly. If the people involved choose them. Ethan's eyes moved to Nia. In the soft glow of the fire, she looked less like the woman he had once tried to define and more like the full truth of who she had become without him, poised, deeply loved, and no longer shaped by anyone else's limitations. I do not expect anything from tonight, Ethan said carefully. I know I have no right to ask for a place in what you built. Nia held his gaze. No, you do not. Her honesty was not cruel. It was clean. The kind of truth that does not wound because it no longer needs to. Ethan nodded, accepting it. But if there is ever a school play, a soccer game, a science fair, anything, I would like the chance to show up now. The room fell into a silence that felt less heavy than before, as if possibility had quietly entered through the cracks regret left behind. Micah's eyes lit up first. I have a school assembly next Friday. Ethan blinked, almost startled by the immediacy of hope. You do? The boy nodded enthusiastically. I am reading a poem about winter trees. Daniel smiled. He has been practicing all week. Ethan looked between them, something fragile and unfamiliar rising in his chest. Not entitlement. Gratitude. The chance to earn a place in the margins of a life he had once forfeited. Nia studied him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the measured strength that had rebuilt her world from the ruins of his words. You can come, she said. Ethan's breath caught, but then she added the boundary that made the invitation real instead of sentimental. Not as a father reclaiming something, as a man learning how to be present. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. Daniel's expression softened into the smallest trace of approval, not because Ethan had earned trust, but because he had finally stopped demanding it. Micah, satisfied with the grown-ups finally speaking in truths he could understand, slid from his chair and padded toward the wide windows. Snow had started falling outside, soft white flecks drifting over the city lights. Look, he whispered, pressing a hand to the glass. All four of them rose almost instinctively and moved to stand beside him. Their reflections appeared faintly in the dark window, Nia in the center, Daniel at one side, Ethan at the other, and Micah between all of them, held by proximity if not yet by history. The little boy looked up at the snow and then asked the question that shifted the room once more. Can both of you come to my assembly? His eyes moved between Daniel and Ethan with complete sincerity. Because one can cheer when I forget the poem, and the other can still tell me I was the best tree in the forest. For a moment, the only sound in the suite was the soft hiss of snow against the glass and the muted hum of Chicago breathing beneath them. Micah's question lingered in the warm air with the kind of innocence only a child could carry without realizing he had just asked for lives to rearrange themselves around hope. Can both of you come to my assembly? Ethan felt the words settle somewhere deeper than regret. Not as a demand, not even as forgiveness, as invitation. A chance to stand in the same room as the life he had missed and choose not to fail it again. Daniel was the first to answer, his voice calm and certain. I would not miss it for anything. Micah's smile widened, then his bright gray-blue eyes lifted to Ethan. For the first time that night, Ethan did not feel the instinct to overpromise, to buy certainty with polished words. He understood now that trust had to be built in smaller things. Real things. I will be there, he said softly. And if you forget the poem, I will still clap the loudest. Micah laughed, satisfied, then pressed both palms to the cold window as the snow thickened over the city lights. Nia watched the exchange in silence, but the tension in her shoulders had changed. It was no longer the rigid distance of protection. It was the measured stillness of someone deciding whether the future could hold a new shape without disturbing the peace she had fought so hard to build. The fire crackled behind them, filling the room with a warmth that made the suite feel less like a private archive and more like a place where a family was learning how to speak honestly for the first time. Daniel turned slightly toward Ethan, the reflection of snowlight and firelight softening his expression. The assembly starts at 9 in the morning, he said. Lincoln Elementary. Auditorium on the second floor. Parking is a nightmare, so come early. The practicality of it, the complete lack of drama, hit Ethan almost harder than anything else tonight. Daniel was not granting him access to a child. He was including him in a moment because Micah had asked, and because real fatherhood had taught him that children should not carry adult pride. Ethan nodded. I will be there before 8:30. Micah spun around from the window, delighted. Can we all get pancakes after? The room softened into quiet laughter. Daniel glanced at Nia, giving her space to decide. She looked at Micah first, because she had always centered what mattered most. Then her gaze shifted to Ethan, searching not for perfection, but for sincerity. Pancakes after, she agreed. The simple plan felt strangely sacred, not because it solved anything, but because it gave tomorrow a shape. Ethan had spent years believing healing arrived in grand gestures. Tonight, he was finally learning it begins with showing up for breakfast after a second-grade poem. The legacy recorder's red lights still blinked on the table behind them, silently preserving every word spoken in this room. Ethan glanced at it, then at Micah's reflection in the window. Can I ask you something? He said gently. The boy nodded. Ethan took a careful breath. What is your poem about? Micah grinned with the kind of pride only children bring to things they have practiced in secret. Winter trees. Daniel chuckled softly. He picked it because he says trees look strongest when they are bare. Ethan looked down at Micah, surprised by the quiet wisdom in the answer. That is a good reason. Micah nodded seriously. My teacher says winter trees prove they are alive even when people think nothing is happening. The words landed in the room with more meaning than the child intended, and all three adults felt it. Nia's eyes moved to Ethan for just a second, something unspoken passing between them. Once, he had looked at her pain and mistaken it for emptiness. He had not understood that survival is often invisible while it is happening. Daniel stepped back toward the chairs, giving Micah room to keep watching the snowfall. We should head home soon, he said quietly. It is a school night. The phrase itself carried a tenderness Ethan had never once considered part of real love until tonight. School night. Bedtime. Tomorrow's clothes laid out. Permission slips signed. Lives built not in dramatic declarations, but in repeated care. Micah turned from the window and ran to the small oak table where the legacy recorder sat blinking. Does this save everything? He asked. Nia smiled. Yes, baby. It keeps the story. Micah looked between the adults with a solemnity far beyond his years. Then I wanted to remember this part too. He climbed into the chair and leaned toward the recorder, his little voice clear and sure. My family is big enough for everyone who stays kind. The room went still. Ethan felt his throat tighten again, but this time the ache was threaded with something warmer. Not absolution. Possibility. Daniel rested a hand on Micah's shoulder. Nia closed her eyes for the briefest second, as if allowing herself to believe the future might be something gentler than the past. Then the sweet phone on the side table rang, its sudden chime breaking the intimacy of the moment. Nia crossed the room and answered softly. After a brief pause, she turned back, surprise touching her face for the first time all night. That was the school office, she said. Her eyes landed on Micah. They just moved tomorrow's assembly to first thing in the morning because of the snowstorm. We need to leave early. Micah gasped with excitement, but Ethan felt something else settle in his chest. Tomorrow had arrived sooner than any of them expected, and for the first time in 6 years, he was being given a real chance to prove that this time, he would not be the one who left. By 7:30 the next morning, Chicago was wrapped in fresh snow. The city softened beneath a white hush that made everything feel newly possible. Lincoln Elementary stood warm against the winter gray, its brick walls glowing beneath strings of soft exterior lights the janitor had left on against the storm. Inside, the second-floor auditorium buzzed with the gentle chaos of children in winter coats, parents brushing snow from their sleeves, and teachers guiding rows of folding chairs into place. The scent of coffee, damp wool, and construction paper drifted through the room. On the small stage, a painted backdrop of silver trees and paper snowflakes shimmered under the school lights. Ethan arrived at 8:15 exactly, earlier than promised, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his dark wool coat. For a moment he stood at the auditorium doors, taking in the kind of ordinary morning he had once been too consumed to value. Parents waving from the second row, children whispering last-minute lines. The quiet miracle of people choosing to show up before the workday even began. Then he saw them. Nia sat near the front, elegant even in a camel coat and simple black gloves, her presence steady and composed. Beside her, Daniel was helping Micah straighten the silver scarf that matched the winter tree costume the second graders had been given. The little boy looked up, spotted Ethan, and his face lit with immediate recognition. "You came." The words hit Ethan with a warmth no quarterly wind had ever given him. He crossed the aisle and knelt beside Micah's chair. "I said I would." Micah grinned, then leaned closer and whispered with complete seriousness, "If I forget the middle part, it is the line about branches still reaching." Ethan nodded as if this were the most important briefing of his life. "Then, that is the line I will be waiting for." Daniel rose from his seat and met Ethan's gaze with the calm respect that had defined every moment between them since the gala. "Glad you made it through the snow." Ethan gave a small, honest smile. "I was not missing this." There was no tension in the exchange now, only the quiet understanding of two men who had learned that love for the same child did not have to be a contest when the child's peace came first. The auditorium lights dimmed, and the principal stepped to the microphone with a cheerful welcome, thanking everyone for braving the storm to celebrate the second grade winter showcase. Micah squeezed between Nia and Daniel one last time before joining his class backstage. As he disappeared behind the curtain, he turned back and looked straight at Ethan, then Daniel, then Nia, as if silently counting the people who had chosen to be there. The performance began with music and soft laughter, tiny voices carrying through the auditorium as children recited lines about snow, silence, and winter skies. Then it was Micah's turn. He stepped into the center spotlight dressed in gray and silver, small hands steady at his sides, curls catching the pale stage light like a halo. For one terrifying second, he froze. The room held its breath. Ethan felt his own pulse jump, but before fear could settle, he began to clap softly. Once, twice, the same rhythm he had promised. Daniel joined him immediately. Then Nia. Soon the whole front row followed, not loud enough to overwhelm, just enough to remind a child he was not alone. Micah's eyes found them. First Daniel, whose smile carried years of safety. Then Nia, whose calm strength had always steadied the room. Then Ethan, who had arrived exactly when he said he would. Something in the boy's face relaxed. He took a breath and began. "Winter trees look empty to people who only notice leaves," he said clearly, his voice carrying through the auditorium. "But they are strongest when the world thinks nothing is happening." Ethan felt the words settle over him like grace. Micah continued, stronger now, the rhythm of the poem building with every line. "Their branches still reach. Their roots still hold. They are alive in the cold, preparing for spring." The final line landed in a hush so complete even the storm outside seemed to pause. Then the room erupted into applause. Micah's face broke into a proud smile as he bowed awkwardly, the silver scarf slipping sideways. Ethan was on his feet before he even realized it, clapping harder than anyone else in the room. Beside him, Daniel laughed warmly and stood too, and Nia rose between them, her eyes bright with something softer than relief. Pride. The children filed off stage, and moments later Micah came running down the aisle straight toward the three of them. Without hesitation, he threw one arm around Daniel and the other around Ethan, then leaned his head against Nia's side. In that small, imperfect, beautiful tangle, the truth of the night before finally became real. Family was not erased by what had been lost. It was expanded by who kept showing up. Nia looked from Daniel to Ethan, then down at Micah tucked between them, and for the first time in years her smile held no shadow from the past. Only the quiet certainty of a future shaped by presence instead of pain. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft white sheets over the city, but inside the school auditorium, beneath paper trees and winter lights, something gentler had finally taken root. Ethan had once told her no one would ever love her again. Now he stood in the proof that love had grown larger than his cruelty, stronger than absence, and wise enough to make room for a man learning how to stay. And when Micah looked up with bright eyes and said, "Can we still get pancakes now?" all three adults answered at the same time. "Absolutely."